is a torque? A torque is a twisting force. A force that makes things spin or rotate or twist. I have this teapot here. I'm applying a force. That didn't make it spin. That just made it move. Translational. That's what you're used to. But if I push this roll of tape, I make it spin, right? So a torque is a force that makes anything spin or rotate. And so you might be wondering, what kind of force? Well, it could be any force. It could be friction, tension, a normal force, and all those other forces you know. Can gravity cause a torque? You bet. We'll talk about that in a bit. All right, I'm gonna put my own spin on this, but stay tuned. Okay, when we're talking about torque, we have to know what pivot point means. Pivot point is the point about which the rest of the mass is rotating. So for instance, if you're doing a bicep curl, your forearm is rotating about your elbow. So your elbow would be the pivot point. For a door handle, I rotate the handle, right? And the handle is rotating about this point right here, which is the pivot point. If I rotate my head, the pivot point is my neck, or the base of my neck. Besides pivot points, you can also have an axis of rotation. For instance, if you're looking at a door that's rotating about its hinges, it's rotating around an entire axis, a vertical axis. And so it's the same thing as a pivot point, except it's not a point, it's an entire axis, or like a line that it's rotating about. This is a door. Welcome. Now, I don't know if you adore doors, but we're going to learn about them today. Did you ever wonder why a handle is on this side of the door and not on this side? Now, I don't know if you can handle this, but you're about to find out. All right, so normally you walk up to a door, you grab the handle, you open it, voila, you're in. All right, I'm gonna prove to you that I can open the door on this side with my pinky. Here's my pinky. I'm opening the door with my pinky. Voila. Okay? Now what if I try to push on this side of the door? Can I do it with my pinky? Let's try. I can't. My pinky is weak. Now I can't quite put my finger on it, why that is. But if I use my whole hand, put more force, and I push a little harder, I can open the door. But that was a lot harder because I couldn't do it with my pinky. So the hinges are on this side, and we see now that the handle is on the opposite side of the hinges. So if you're far away from the hinges, it's easier to open the door. Maybe that's why they put the handle there, because that's where it's easiest to open the door. But we're not going to leave it there. We have to talk about the physics about it, of course. So if we talk about torque, where the hinges are, that's like our pivot point. And when you open the door's rotating about the hinges, or about that pivot point. So if I push over here, I'm applying a force, right? So I'm pushing the door. I'm applying that force at a very large radius, or at a very big distance away from the pivot point, right? So when I push with my pinky, I'm applying a force to the door at a big distance from the pivot point, from the hinges in this case. Now if I apply that same force, my pinky, close to the pivot point, I'm applying the same force, but I'm not getting the same result. I still can't make the door open. You can see here that where you apply the force matters. So if I apply the same force further away from the pivot point, I get a bigger torque. The farther away you are from the pivot point, the more torque you generate. And that's why it's easier to make the door rotate when I push far away from the hinges versus when I push close to them. You get a lot less torque when you're pushing so close to the pivot point. Okay, so we know that the distance from the pivot point where you apply the force affects how much torque you get, or how easy it is to make this door spin, right? The closer you are to the pivot point, the less torque you get. The farther out you are from the pivot point, the more torque you get. And so we call this the radius. Okay, so what else affects torque? Well, you saw I couldn't open it over here with my pinky, but I could open it by pushing with my full hand and pushing harder. So that means that the force also affects how much torque you get. So the more force you apply, the more torque you get, and you can get the door to rotate. here and I barely apply any force, I'm still not going to get the door to open. So the amount of force I apply also affects how much torque you get. Okay, and finally, what about the angle? Would you ever approach a door from here and like try to open it like this? Probably not, right? Why? When you approach a door, you face it and you open it, right? So I wonder why no one does this. I can't make this door move. So what you just saw there, I was pushing parallel to the door. So the force was directed in towards the pivot point, right? I was pushing in towards the hinges. When I normally open the door, I'm pushing perpendicularly to the pivot point, right? The only way you can get a torque or make an object spin or rotate is to apply a perpendicular force at a distance. You saw me pushing parallel to the door. That didn't produce any torque. I sure was applying a force, but because I was pushing parallel to the door, I couldn't make it rotate. If I push perpendicularly, then I can get it to rotate. So if I push at an angle, say like this, right? Part of me is pushing parallel, and part of me is pushing perpendicularly. So yes, I can still open the door, but only a part of the force that I was applying was actually generating a torque, was actually making the door open. In conclusion, the most effective way to open a door is to open it as far away as possible from the hinges and push perpendicularly to the door. So now, hopefully every time you open a door, you think these torque thoughts. You might be wondering, does torque even apply to anything besides doors? Because if that's it, that's pretty lame. Well, it does. For instance, I have some pork on a fork, and I'm going to apply a torque to it. I take the fork off my plate, I rotate it. Let me chew this. So initially, the fork was pointed downwards, and then I rotated it so that I could get it in my mouth. How did I make it rotate? I applied a torque, or a twisting force, to make the fork twist so I could eat. So yeah, every time you're eating, you are playing that torque game with your fork.
Alright, in my final example, voila!
Alright, so if you use makeup, and even if you don't, you're probably going to meet someone in your life who uses makeup. And little did you know, people who use makeup are torque experts. Because when you're putting mascara on your eyelashes, I'm slightly rotating this brush so I can get the stuff on my lashes, right? And so there's a reason that makeup companies don't make the handle of your mascara like 10 feet long. If you had a handle that was really long, right, you wouldn't have any control over your brush because there'd be a lot of torque, and you actually don't want a lot of torque because the more torque you create, the easier it is for the brush to rotate and flop around, and so you have less control. And so there's a short lever arm, and you have much more control over what you're doing with your mascara. So yes, even makeup designers think about torque when they're making your makeup. I didn't make up what I just said about makeup, I promise. This is gravity causing a torque. Torque! You can think of a person in a handstand essentially as like a long rod, right? Okay, so when I was in a handstand and I was perfectly vertical, I wasn't falling over, right? Gravity was still acting on me. I didn't start floating, but I didn't fall over. And that's because gravity was acting parallel to my body, and so it wasn't applying any torque. However, the second that I became sort of misaligned, like a little bit this way, there was now an angle between me and the force of gravity. Because remember, gravity always acts downwards. Once there was that angle between me and gravity applied a torque, and it made me rotate about my hands and fall down. All right, this Greek symbol right here represents torque. This is the Greek letter tau, or T-A-U. It rhymes with cow, now, how. How can the cow say tau? The equation for torque is a force times a radius. The F obviously stands for force. The R is the distance from the pivot point, or the axis of rotation, to where the force is being applied.
Another word for the R is lever arm.
So for the door, that would be from the hinges all the way to where my hand was applying the force. Remember, we also said that the angle matters, and so there's also a sine theta at the end. The force is perpendicular to your radius, then sine theta becomes 1, and you're left with the torque is equal to just the force times the radius. Otherwise, theta is the angle between the force and the distance to the force. The units of torque are Newton meters. Because forces are measured in newtons, a distance is measured in meters. You're used to drawing free body diagrams as a box with a bunch of arrows, and all that mattered was the direction of the arrows and the length of the arrows. When we're dealing with torque, that changes a bit. So when you're dealing with torque, you usually have some sort of rod or elongated thing like a seesaw or something like that. Let's say that this is a seesaw and that there is one person sitting on one side. So the seesaw rotates about a point in its center, the pivot point. And the way that we draw a pivot point is a little triangle. If there's a person sitting on this side, then they have a weight. The force of gravity is acting on them.
And so they push down on the seesaw with a force equal to their weight.
So I'm going to call this F person, the force of the person on the seesaw. So we're still drawing forces, but what matters now is where the forces are applied. So yes, this person is applying a downwards force on the seesaw, but I can't just draw that force anywhere. And the person is applying this force at a certain distance r away from the pivot point. And so when you are drawing torque diagrams like this, it does matter where you place the forces. So in this case, the person is on the right side, applying the force downward. That's going to make the seesaw rotate that way. But if the person was on the other side and they were applying force downward, that would make the seesaw rotate that way. So it does matter where you place those. Well, you're probably wondering about gravity. And you're right, you should be. Gravity still exists. So the force of gravity still acts downward. Gravity acts at the center of mass, and that happens to be right through the pivot point, right? Seesaws are designed that way so that the pivot point is right where the center of mass is. And so the force of gravity acts directly through this, and so the force of gravity acts directly through the pivot point, and because it is at a distance of 0 from the pivot point, it exerts no torque. So the force of gravity is still exerting a force. However, it does not cause the seesaw to spin or rotate because it is acting through the pivot point.
Forces acting through the pivot point exert no torque. And yes, there's a normal force that also acts through the pivot point, and so it exerts no torque.